Welcome to Standard 12A. In this standard, we will explain the causes of the Cold War, which is our next topic and refers to the period of very high tension that existed between the United States, abbreviated USA, and the Soviet Union, abbreviated USSR for Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, that went on between 1945, when World War II ended, and 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. Some essential understanding to put this in context. The Cold War's foundations really came from a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, really in terms of lifestyle and economics and political systems. And those differences after World War II really lay the foundation for the Cold War. Some essential knowledge, our first part here, we're going to take a look at what were the actual causes in the beginning between roughly 1945, when World War II ends, and about 3 years later, 1948. What occurs in that time that causes the Cold War? The first thing we need to understand is that both the United States and Soviet Union had differing and really opposite political and economic systems. From the United States' worldview, they saw the economy, the only economic answer really was capitalism or free enterprise system, where individuals were largely in control of producing products, setting prices for products, and setting quantities for products. In other words, individuals largely in charge of the economy. In sharp contrast was the Soviet worldview that the economy should be organized around the principles of communism, of collective ownership, of state-run businesses and factories, and prices and quantities being set by the government. And these two economic philosophies really were at opposite ends of the spectrum. There's not a whole lot of compatibility between those systems. Likewise, the worldview of both the United States and Soviet Union differed very much in terms of government. Whereas the United States saw the only correct answer for government to be a democracy, having voting and people participating in the political process, the Soviets saw the answer in totalitarian dictatorship, one strong leader who set the agenda, who made the plans, and ran the country. Now, it's not unusual that countries have differences in these systems, but what really was important to understand here is that both the United States and the Soviet Union were so committed to these principles and these ideas that they were willing to spend a lot of money and spend a lot of resources, and when needed, to spill a lot of blood in terms of conflict and wars over the second part of the 20th century to achieve and see their views on these issues put in place throughout the world. Because of those differences in worldview, a rivalry develops between the United States and the Soviet Union. There's a couple of reasons for it. I mean, in part, it's geography. Okay, both two very large countries spanning huge areas of the globe. They're countries with big populations. But there's more to it than just that. It really goes back to the founding of the Soviet Union back in 1917. Earlier in the course, we took a look at the Russian Revolution. And from the United States' point of view, that was not a positive development. It occurs during World War I, and presumably for the sake of securing some ports in the north of Russia when Russia drops out of World War I, American troops are sent to Russia during this time, where they do become involved in supporting the non-communist army, the whites, in their fight against the communist forces, the Bolsheviks and the Red Army. Okay, and that memory is really kind of the seed there of some of this rivalry that develops later on in the 20th century. In the propaganda poster we see there on the right from the Soviet Union, we see the United States along with its allies England and France. This would have been around the time of World War I, holding on a leash the three dogs there, three Russian generals who were generals for the White Army, the non-communist forces. The implication being that it's the United States' involvement in the conflict that's driving the non-communist forces. That rivalry, though, throughout the 20th century is going to develop and find its way into many different aspects of life. We see it in things like science and technology. When the Soviets launched Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space, okay, and really kicked off the space race, which culminates a decade or so later with the United States landing Neil Armstrong on the moon. Okay, that rivalry kind of is what's driving that space race. You see it in the athletic arena. The Olympics really become a battleground for the Cold War. When the Soviets defeated the Americans in the 1972 Olympics in basketball, what's supposed to be the Americans' game, that was a huge public relations victory for the Soviets. And 8 years later, in 1980, when the United States defeated the Soviet Union in hockey, supposed to be the Soviets' game, that was a huge public relations victory for the United States. But more seriously, the Cold War, in a historical sense, plays out in this competition for allies and friendly countries around the world, this kind of dividing the world up into those who sided with the United States and those who sided with the Soviet Union. And hanging over everybody's heads during this time were these large arsenals of nuclear weapons stockpiled by both the Soviet Union and the United States. Okay, the third factor we'll address here is the Yalta Conference. And the Yalta Conference was a meeting held in a Soviet city on the Black Sea called Yalta. And this is in the closing weeks of World War II in Europe. Victory seems very close to the Allies, the English, the Americans, and the Soviets, who were on the same side during World War II. Despite the rivalry we just discussed, the Americans and the Soviets were on the same side. They had a common enemy in Hitler and Germany during World War II, so they put that rivalry on hold and combined to defeat the Germans. However, once the war was over, okay, the differences begin to emerge again. And at the Yalta Conference, you see in the photograph at the bottom, that's Winston Churchill on the left from England. You see Franklin Roosevelt, the American president, in the middle, and Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, on the right. They met to discuss the future of Europe, how Europe would look after World War II. And one of the things they agreed to was that the Soviets would have influence over Eastern Europe. Okay, that the Soviet Union, that their influence would extend into those countries of Eastern Europe, with a promise that they would be allowed to have elections and have democracies being friendly to the Soviet Union. From the American, the English point of view, though, it becomes a land grab, that the Soviets wanted those territories for themselves. From the Russian point of view, they were really interested in creating a buffer between them and Germany, the country that had really been responsible for millions of Russian dead in both World War I and World War II. But we really see at the Yalta Conference, and I think that photograph, if you take a look at it, you can see the split occurring there between just the body language of Stalin on the right and Roosevelt and Churchill on the left. That divide is going to become known as the Iron Curtain, an observation that Winston Churchill makes when he mentions that an iron curtain has descended across the continent of Europe, referencing the separation into a Western Europe that was pro-United States and a Eastern Europe that was controlled by the Soviet Union. Okay, and then our last factor we'll mention here was called the Truman Doctrine. You're looking there in the top right corner at the American president after World War II, Harry Truman. And Harry Truman makes a declaration during this time. Greece and Turkey were both under pressure from communist forces that wanted those countries to be communist. And Truman declared that the United States would help any country that was fighting to stop communism from taking over. The term containment is applied to this. If you think of any cup or jar or any kind of vessel that holds water or liquid of any kind, as long as it stays in the cup, as long as it stays in the jar, it's not going to damage or make anything get on anything. But once that container leaks, okay, once the liquid is out of the container, then it begins to spread. And that really describes the U.S. policy here under the Truman Doctrine. It wanted to stop the spread of communism from those areas it already was. Okay, so initially it was supplying money and food and assistance to Greece and Turkey to resist communism, but later on, as we get further into the standard in Standard 12B, it's the reason why the United States gets involved in far-off conflicts in Korea, in Vietnam, and other places around the world. And that concludes what we need to know for Standard 12A, Part 1.